Our next speaker this morning is going to be Professor James Jones, and he is a professor at Louis D. Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. He graduated with a BA from the University of Virginia, and he got his law degree here at Duke. Before entering an academic career, he clerked for a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit and a magistrate judge at the United States District Court for the Middle District of Florida. Additionally, he worked in private practice for firms in New York and Florida. And in 1985, he entered teaching as a Bigelow Teaching Fellow and Lecturer in Law at the University of Chicago Law School. And he joined the faculty of the Louis D. Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville in 1986. So welcome, Professor Jones.
Well, good morning. As you heard, I'm James T.R. Jones, professor at Louis D. Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. Anybody ever feels like coming to visit, we have a little horse race the first Monday in May every year that people enjoy. Well, it's a real honor and privilege to be invited to speak here in Durham today. I'm here to speak about high-functioning, successful professionals with severe mental illness. Kind of a very different population than what you heard about from the last speaker. Well, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder. As of 2012, an estimated 18.6% of Americans ages 18 and over, or at least 43.7 million people, suffer from mental disorder in any given year. The principal burden of mental illness is concentrated in those of the population with severe mental illness. This includes major depressive disorder, which touches roughly 16 million American adults per year, bipolar disorder, about 6.1 million per year, schizophrenia, an estimated 2.6 million per year, and borderline personality disorder, an estimated 3.75 million. 2 times as many people live with schizophrenia as with HIV/AIDS. Mental illness is the leading cause of disability for Americans between ages 15 and 44 and accounts for over 15% of the U.S. disease burden, which is more than the burden of all cancers. It can strike anyone, regardless of age, race, sex, or occupation. Legal and medical professionals and students certainly aren't immune from its various manifestations. Indeed, they have some of the highest rates of these disorders out of all groups in society. No one knows exactly how many have a mental illness because they all too often keep their disease a secret. Many do this because they fear stigma if they're open to others. Perhaps one of the best or worst examples of stigma in professionals is the situation in many states where medical and bar licensing agencies ask intrusive and inquisitional questions about any history of mental health conditions or treatment of applicants. Students who fear they won't be approved for a license if they answer truthfully to these inquiries, they'll forego mental health treatment they desperately need in order truthfully to deny having a diagnosis or treatment. This choice can gravely affect them. Despite stigma concerns, some high-functioning professionals go public with their mental health diagnosis to try to reduce stigma by showing prominent people have severe mental illness. Serious mental illness profoundly affects a professional who suffers from it. It impairs the cognitive ability, the essence of functioning as a professional, especially practicing law or medicine, or teaching those. Imagine the despair one endures when one's mind, which has been the key to all the success in one's life, suddenly becomes one's worst enemy. This situation was brought to light by the story of Nobel laureate John Forbes Nash, Jr., as portrayed in the book and movie A Beautiful Mind. Some successful professionals have been hospitalized numerous times for their illness, attempted to die by suicide, and lost jobs and years of their working lives to severe manifestations of their illness. Still, they soldier on with no alternative other than disability or suicide. Neither is an attractive alternative. In this speech, I first will discuss severe mental illness in the United States among legal and medical students and professionals. Next, I'll look at stigma and why it keeps most of those with mental illness in the shadows, with a focus on the licensure issue. Finally, I'll give examples of successful medical and legal professionals who've gone public with the disease and discuss how they function as they do, notwithstanding the special challenges they face every day. They show how a potentially tragic circumstance can have a positive course through hard work, good medical care, and a modicum of luck. Numerous sources attest to the high incidence of mental illness in the medical field. Medical students see their mental health start to decline almost as soon as they start medical school, and it goes downhill from there. One study shows that at the end of their first year, 57% have moderate to severe symptoms of anxiety, and 27% moderate to severe symptoms of depression. Immediately prior to graduation, as many as 38% of medical students may be depressed. A starting 11.2% have suicidal ideation, which is a well-established predictor of suicide planning and attempts. Medical students are less likely to seek mental health care than the general population, even though they have better access to it. Female medical students have significantly higher levels of depression, anxiety, and psychological distress than male ones, and single students have higher depression rates than married ones. Marriage is a good thing. The seeds of mental illness that are planted in medical school bear fruit among practicing physicians. Many physicians feel social isolation and don't take proper care of themselves. Some follow dangerous approaches to care, such as self-prescribing antidepressant medications. The suicide rate among male physicians is 40% higher than in men in general population. And that for women physicians is a staggering 130% greater than among women in the general population. Every year, 300 to 400 physicians and medical students die by suicide, a number that's enough to fill several medical school classes. In sum, medical students and physicians face many psychiatric issues. They have high rates of anxiety and depression. Suicidal ideation is a major problem. They attempt and complete suicide at appalling rates, not what those who care for others need to do for themselves. As bad as things are for medical students and physicians, law students and lawyers have it worse. Law students suffer from more mental illness than any other graduate or professional students. Their level of stress is much higher than that of medical students. They have a much higher level of depression than medical students. Law school is less nurturing of its students than medical school is of its. Law schools don't specialize in warm and fuzzy. We're not warm and fuzzy people. And law students are much less likely to seek psychological counseling than medical students are. When students enter law school, they're no different psychologically than the general population their age. Things quickly change. By the end of their first year, 32% are depressed, and by graduation, 40% of law students are depressed. Some blame this on issues like the Socratic method, class ranking of first-year students, awareness that large firms only hire from the top 10% of the class, peer-to-peer stigmatization, and professor feedback. Competition for grades is fierce and generates a heavy workload among the competitors. Law school is injurious to good mental health. But competition for top grades isn't the whole story. Perhaps surprisingly, or perhaps not, the top students at elite law schools like Duke, the ones large firms want to hire, also have widespread depression. Perhaps even worse are results of a study of law students and suicide. According to it, 20.4% of the students surveyed had thought seriously about suicide sometime in their lives, and 6.3% had thought seriously about suicide in the preceding 12 months. Graduation from law school is no panacea. Anxiety and depression pervade the legal profession. Attorneys have a much higher rate of depression than the general population, and the distress suffered by depressed lawyers is greater than that of depressed members in other groups. In a study of practicing lawyers, 20 to 35% were clinically distressed, compared with only 2% of the general population. 11% of attorneys consider suicide every month, and they are at least twice as likely to die by suicide as those in the general public. In the microcosm of Kentucky, recent years have seen a rash of lawyer suicides, especially among middle-aged trial lawyers. CNN did a story last year about suicide in Kentucky lawyers. One of my former students died by suicide when he was about 35. Are these figures regarding the prevalence of mental illness in legal and medical students and practitioners accurate? Probably not. Those with it often stay in the shadows due to fear of stigma. Those with mental illness learn that stigma and discrimination have followed mental illness throughout history. People suffering from psychiatric conditions are the most stigmatized group in contemporary society. While most people no longer use the degrading racial and ethnic slurs that once were common, ridicule of those with mental illness endures. The stigma against people with mental illness is so great that job applicants with it fear to disclose it to potential employers. Examples of the impact of stigma include the story of Senator Thomas Eagleton, who the Democratic Party nominated for vice president in 1972, then forced off the ticket when it was learned that he had been treated for depression and given electroshock treatment more than a decade before. The stigma of schizophrenia is so great that one authority calls those with that illness the lepers of the modern day. The needless suffering due to stigma can cause significant harm, like denying symptoms and delaying treatment. Although depression can be treated successfully, only 29% of those with it contact mental health professionals. Often this is because of fear of stigma. The negative views about mental illness, which are at the heart of this stigma, can exclude individuals from access to housing, employment, insurance, and proper medical care. A study made after the Newtown, Connecticut school shooting makes the impact of stigma stark. Almost half of all respondents thought that people with severe mental illness are more dangerous than people in the general population. This despite a report from the U.S. Surgeon General that emphasizes that the vast majority of those with mental illness are not violent, and that the percentage of the violence in society caused by those with mental illness is very small. In this survey after Newtown, most respondents stated they were unwilling to have someone with a severe mental illness as a coworker and a neighbor. You couple these results with a study that was done in 2013 that showed that psychiatrists are prejudiced against their own patients, such that they would give them worse health care than individuals who don't have a mental illness. It's no surprise that most with mental illness kept their condition a secret. I found it horrible, a survey that showed that if you described a hypothetical patient to a psychiatrist and asked them for a treatment course, there was one treatment course for the persons, and then there was another treatment course for those that had well-controlled schizophrenia. And if you had a hypothetical patient with well-controlled schizophrenia, it was a whole different treatment package just because of that. Since mental illness is like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression are biologically based and can be treated extremely successfully, these attitudes are particularly unfortunate and harmful. Medical and law students and professionals with mental illness face special stigma concerns. They'll pay cash for mental health treatment rather than use their health insurance to avoid having a record of their care appear in an insurance database, and will duck their heads lest someone they know recognize them while they're in their psychiatrist's waiting room. Law students fear stigma from their professors or if they disclose having a mental illness, while attorneys won't hire attorneys with mental illness. Medical students with a history of counseling suffer reduced prospects for residency placements. Practicing physicians with psychiatric disorders encounter discrimination in hospital privileges, health insurance, and malpractice insurance. Fear of stigma prevents 30% of depressed first and second year medical students from using mental health services and may stop 38.2% of law students from doing so. A physician can try to avoid stigma by taking drug samples, so she has no history of taking psychiatric medication. I found a story about one person who actually was a law student whose father was a psychiatrist, and she avoided the records by having her father give her samples that he got to treat her bipolar disorder. Well, finally and tragically, stigma can kill. Two examples will suffice. The first is of attorney and Clinton administration official Vince Foster, who died by suicide in 1993 after a few months in Washington. Foster didn't seek psychiatric treatment for the depression from which he suffered because he was afraid he would lose his White House security clearance if he had a history of doing that. The second example is popular Vermont Law School professor Cheryl Hanna, who died by suicide on July 27 last year. Hanna, who was a Harvard Law School graduate and an expert on constitutional law and women in the law, was severely depressed. She was hospitalized voluntarily in a psychiatric unit, but she was afraid that stigma for being there would damage her career, so she checked herself out after 3 days. She then, unbeknownst to her family, went and bought a handgun, which she then used to end her life. By far the most pervasive stigma in the medical and legal realms occurs in the licensing process. Traditional medical and law licensing bodies have required applicants to disclose any history of mental health treatment via the aforementioned intrusive questions. The questions typically focus on whether the applicant merely has a diagnosis of mental illness, not solely on conduct that actually indicates a reason for concern. A positive response leads to additional questions and a demand for access to all the applicant's mental health records from psychiatrists, therapists, and hospitals. The result can be a hearing before a panel of untrained lay professionals, a delay in getting a license. Several people had over a year delay in getting their license because of this. And expensive prerequisites to the license other applicants don't have to incur. It can even cause a conditional admission that effectively can leave the applicant on probation for many years and may be a matter of public record. This is unfortunate given the views of the American Psychiatric Association, which says that having a psychiatric history isn't an accurate predictor of mental fitness, and accordingly, status questions are inappropriate. An applicant can have great difficulty getting a license in one state despite being successfully admitted in several others because of the various hurdles erected by licensing agencies. Gradually, due to the Americans with Disabilities Act, courts in the U.S. Department of Justice have attacked these intrusive questions and the process to which they give rise. Despite this, some state licensing bodies still use them, such that there's a state-by-state battle against them. As noted, the result is often law and medical license applicants who don't get medical treatment that they need in order not to answer yes to the application questions. They suffer needlessly as a result and may even die by suicide as a result of their suffering. An example of this situation is the tortuous story of the Louisiana Supreme Court. It included on its character and fitness application the objectionable questions regarding whether the applicant had ever been diagnosed with a mental illness, rather than only focusing on inappropriate conduct because of a mental illness. An affirmative response brought down a variety of consequences on the applicant. Perhaps the worst was requiring the applicant to pay for investigation of him or her based merely on having a disability, not keeping the information that was gotten confidential, and imposing burdensome conditions on admission, such as the conditional admission system. When the Justice Department challenged this process in 2014, the eventual result, after extended negotiation, was a settlement agreement that invalidated this system. The Louisiana Supreme Court agreed to change its admission questionnaire and procedures to fit the parameters of the ADA. Moreover, it will pay a total of $200,000 in compensation to 7 of those affected by its discriminatory practices. Given its substantial legal costs, in addition to the $200,000 damage award, one can hope the example of the Louisiana Supreme Court will inspire other states with a similar admission system to alter it. Such a salutary result will be a welcome change for applicants with a psychiatric disability in states like Texas, Florida, Ohio, Kentucky, and North Carolina. Despite the stigma, some successful professionals in law and medicine have gone public about having a severe mental illness. Most are academics with the safety of tenure. All do so in order to fight stigma by showing someone can excel in his or her field despite suffering from a potentially debilitating mental health disease such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, or borderline personality disorder. For example, Elizabeth Baxter, MD, is a psychiatrist whose battle with mental illness began in her sophomore year at Rhodes College in Memphis. Despite the anguish it caused her, Dr. Baxter led several campus organizations and was elected student body president her senior year. She could hide her illness because she was so prominent on campus. Dr. Baxter began medical school at Vanderbilt, but there her illness became harder to mask. During her second year, she had her first psychotic break and was hospitalized. She returned to medical school, and with medication, psychotherapy, and the support of friends, she was able to continue her studies. Dr. Baxter told those around her that she has a mental illness, and for her honesty, Dr. Baxter was often met with discrimination and stigma. I had trouble getting out of medical school, she recalled, because people weren't too excited about a person with mental illness graduating. Dr. Baxter's honesty also hindered her initial application to residency training in psychiatry. She completed her residency training on schedule, but became ill afterwards, such that a near-fatal suicide attempt put her in the hospital for months. After a long recovery period, Dr. Baxter eventually started to see patients. She's widely known for her mental health advocacy efforts and has traveled the nation speaking about her life and experiences both with mental illness and recovery. Today she practices in Nashville, and she has hospital privileges at Vanderbilt. Frederick J Freeze III, PhD, is a psychologist who's been open about his numerous hospitalizations for schizophrenia. He was diagnosed with the disease when he was a young Marine Corps officer. Yet despite his disability, he was able to gain a degree from the American Graduate School of International Management and a doctorate in psychology from Ohio University. Dr. Freeze has worked in public mental health care for over 4 years and is presently an associate professor of psychiatry at Northeast Ohio Medical University. For 15 years, until his retirement in 1995, he was director of psychology at Western Reserve Psychiatric Hospital. Dr. Freeze founded the Community and State Hospital section of the American Psychological Association and is past president of the National Mental Health Consumers Association. He served on the board of directors of the National Alliance on Mental Illness and is also on the board of scientific advisors for Schizophrenia Bulletin. He's published numerous book chapters and professional articles and speaks widely as a mental health advocate about how those with psychiatric disorders can be successfully treated. Without a doubt, the most famous medical professional with bipolar disorder or any other mental illness is K. Redfield Jameson, PhD. Dr. Jameson first suffered symptoms of mental illness when she was a senior in high school. This was a condition she shared in common with her father and many other members of her family. She seriously contemplated suicide, but refused to seek medical treatment. Dr. Jameson earned her undergraduate degree from UCLA. and then decided to attend graduate school in psychology rather than going to medical school. She got her PhD in clinical psychology at UCLA, studying mental illness in others while denying it in herself. She joined the UCLA psychiatry faculty, growing increasingly manic in the process. She eventually started to take lithium, which is the gold standard drug for bipolar disorder. She took time off from work while she battled madness and found that lithium kept her alive and out of the hospital. Still, she resisted taking the medication and went on and off of it contrary to her psychiatrist's advice. Dr. Jameson refused to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital, in part because she feared losing her hospital privileges if she did so, and she lapsed into a suicidal depression. Finally, she took a massive overdose of lithium and would have died but for a fortuitous telephone call from her brother, which caused him to alert her doctor, who saved her life. Despite her condition, she won tenure from UCLA, and she finally decided to take the medication that would maintain her sanity. She was advised not to have children because of the hereditary nature of bipolar disorder. Dr. Jameson left California for Baltimore, where she today holds the Dalio Family Professorship in Mood Disorders in the Department of Psychiatry at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and is the world's leading expert on the disease from which she has suffered for so long. She co-authored the standard medical text on bipolar disorder for Oxford University Press in 1990. It's now in its second edition. She's written numerous professional books, book chapters, and articles, and has spoken widely. In 1995, Dr. Jameson published the New York Times bestseller, An Unquiet Mind, a memoir of moods and madness, which is still a bestseller 2 decades later. Her inspiring story has moved millions and brought bipolar disorder out of the closet where it was hidden. Still, she was criticized by some of her colleagues for having the temerity to go public with her condition. Dr. Jameson has won countless honors and awards for her extraordinary work as the face of successful medical professionals with severe mental illness, including a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant in 2001. Successful legal professionals, who are almost all law professors, also have written, spoken, and been advocates about their condition. The first is Eleanor Sachs, who's the Orrin B. Evans Professor of Law, Psychology, and Psychiatry, and the Behavioral Sciences at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. Professor Sachs graduated summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, as class valedictorian at Vanderbilt University. While she was there, she had undiagnosed warning symptoms of the onset of schizophrenia. She won a prestigious Marshall Scholarship to study at Oxford University, where she earned an MLit in philosophy. At Oxford, she quickly exhibited psychotic thoughts, self-mutilating acts, and suicidal ideation. She twice voluntarily entered a psychiatric hospital and became increasingly paranoid and delusional. She persevered at Oxford, but lost 3 years to her illness. It took her 4 years to get a 1-year degree. Professor Sachs next went to Yale Law School and soon was hallucinating. She was hospitalized for months, often in mechanical restraints. This treatment deeply scarred her psychologically, such that she has refused to be hospitalized at any time since then. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia with a grave prognosis and stayed ill despite high doses of antipsychotic drugs. Gradually, the medication took effect, and she finally went home. Mental illness had robbed her of another year. The next year, Professor Sachs restarted law school. She became an editor of the Yale Law Journal and earned her JD in the usual 3-year period. Few of her classmates even suspected that she has a severe mental illness. Within a few years of graduation, despite periods of psychosis, Professor Sachs landed a faculty appointment at the Gould School of Law. Her illness didn't bar her from a tenure-track position at a top 20 law school where no one knew anything about her condition. Once in Los Angeles, Professor Sachs embarked on an extremely successful career. Her focus on law and mental disability made her a nationally recognized expert. At times, she has delusions and hallucinations despite taking her medication and seeing her therapist 5 days a week. Notwithstanding that, she won tenure, an endowed chair, and has earned numerous awards for her prolific scholarship. Since 2010, she's held a PhD in psychoanalytic science from the New Center of Psychoanalysis and PhD. She's a PhD in psychoanalysis with schizophrenia. In time, Professor Sachs decided to fight stigma by going public with her story. In 2007, she published her acclaimed memoir, the New York Times bestseller, The Sinner Cannot Hold, My Journey Through Madness, which Time magazine named as one of the top 10 nonfiction books of 2007. She's been an extremely active mental health advocate since 2007 and has won many honors and awards for her efforts. Foremost of these is a $500,000 MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant, some of which she used to fund the Sachs Institute for Mental Health Policy and Ethics, which is a major force in the mental health field. At this point in her life and career, Professor Sachs has accomplished far more than most lawyers or law professors ever do. She's defied dire psychiatric prognoses and bounced back from repeated psychosis. By all measures, a high-functioning professional. Touro law professor Marjorie A. Silver has gone public with having a successful career despite intermittently suffering from major depressive disorder. Professor Silver earned her BA summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa from Brandeis University, and her JD magna cum laude, Order of the Coif, from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She clerked for a United States District Judge and then worked for a decade in the federal government. She's been a law professor for over 30 years. Her depression has fortuitously been episodic rather than chronic, such that she's had 6 periods of major depression scattered over 3 decades. Her first followed the birth of her first child and was debilitating for some time. About then, her marriage collapsed, and she had a relapse that resulted in an attempt to end her life and hospitalization. She entered academia at New York Law School in 1983. Following her remarriage in 1985, she again fell into the abyss and another, this time voluntary, hospitalization. In due course, she recovered, and despite being turned down for tenure at New York, this is not NYU, New York School of Law, she did not fall apart. In 1991, she joined the faculty at Touro and fit in beautifully. Then, a few years later, both of her elderly parents had health crises, and she was overwhelmed with anxiety and depression, such that she had to forego teaching for a semester. This depression, again, inevitably lifted, and she won tenure and promotion to full professor. At this point, unlike previous occasions, Professor Silver and her doctors decided to keep her at a therapeutic dose of antidepressant rather than having her phase off of it. That let her maintain stability despite the deaths of her mother and father, a cancer diagnosis, and other highly stressful events. An avalanche of stressors a few years later precipitated what was her 6th and hopefully last depressive episode. She was forced to take another medical leave until a change in medication helped her stabilize. Professor Silver has been a curricular innovator and works to help her students learn to achieve a balance in their lives. One way she's done this is by being open about having a mental illness with friends, loved ones, students, and others. She served on the now defunded Board of Trustees of the New York State Lawyer Assistance Trust, which assisted impaired attorneys, especially to help those with mental illness in addition to those with substance abuse issues. She emphasizes the obligation of legal professionals with job security akin to tenure to be voices against stigma. Professor Silver contributes a valuable story about those with the most common form of mental illness, depression. She's shown that it can be as debilitating as more severe forms of mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. She clearly is a successful professional with an important message in the battle against both social stigma and the personal shame many with mental illness experience. Professor Gregory M. Duell of William Mitchell College of Law has written about his life and career as a lawyer and law professor with borderline personality disorder. Professor Duell graduated from Yale College, a lot of Yaleys here, and attended Harvard Law School. As a first-year student at Harvard, he felt alienated from his classmates, professors, and school. He developed problems with severe anxiety and depression and was so disillusioned and alienated from law school that he skipped his Harvard graduation. Over the next 7 years, Professor Duell worked at various firms for periods ranging from 6 days to 18 months. He quit jobs because of some combination of depression, irritability, anxiety, and boredom, and was fired for one from resisting the firm hierarchy. He never had problems moving to a new position and repeatedly made impulsive employment decisions. He always blamed the problem with the firm rather than himself. Eventually, Professor Duell was deeply depressed and had reached a dead end in law practice. He was hospitalized for 6 weeks at the Menninger Clinic, along with other patients who were professionals in law, medicine, business, and academics. He then decided to go into law teaching. He was a teaching fellow at Temple Law School, where he earned his LLM. He then taught the law schools at Southern Illinois University and the University of Tulsa before he finally landed at William Mitchell. As he has observed, he's been there for over 4 years, which is 2 years longer than he had held any previous job. He regularly earns superior teaching evaluations, has published widely, and performs substantial service. As a person with BPD, Professor Duell confronts many challenges. Abandonment issues are chronic, and he's been addicted to prescription drugs off and on for nearly 2 decades. While he has not been suicidal or attempted to die by suicide, he engages in self-mutilating behavior. He finds daily life is like a roller coaster because of his mood swings and is plagued by angry outbursts when he deems that he has been wronged. Colleagues have dismissed him as hypersensitive, over-emotional, and self-promotional, and he often is viewed as difficult or demanding. In this, he believes he's like some other faculty with mental illness whose collegiality may be doubted. He thinks in some ways his condition makes him better able to contribute to legal education as he can empathize with others and often works with great drive and energy. Professor Duell offers much to the legal academic realm despite, or as he would argue, because of having BPD. His narrative is another attack on stigma and a means for breaking down the secrecy and isolation that those with mental illness experience. Finally, several legal professionals have gone public about their successful careers while living with bipolar disorder. I am one of them. I was bullied unmercifully as a child and adolescent, trauma that can contribute to mental illness later in life. I had symptoms like frequent irritability, bouts of depression, and poorly handled stress. My mother wanted to take me for counseling, but my father vetoed the idea because he was afraid of stigma later in life if I had a history of such treatment. By age 15, I developed a severe case of duodenal ulcers, which is a harbinger of evolving mental illness. As you heard, I earned my BA in history with highest distinction, Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Virginia. Nevertheless, I struggled with depression and my digestive problems worsened. In my last semester, I nearly died from gastrointestinal bleeding and I underwent ulcer surgery whose complications have led to 2 additional surgeries. Couple that with a later operation caused by the side effect of a psychiatric medication, I've endured 4 major operations because of mental illness. Here at Duke University School of Law, I served on the editorial board of the Duke Law Journal and graduated second in the class of 1978. Still, I again battled depression and had difficulty in the employment practice. I finally landed a position at Davis Polk & Wardwell on Wall Street. Also won a clerkship with the Honorable Gerald Bard Choflat, then on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 5th Circuit, now he's on the 11th Circuit, and one of Duke Law School's most outstanding alumni. While I was in New York City, I was desperately depressed, lonely, and unhappy. I concluded I was unlikely to live past the age of 30 due to the probability of suicide. Indeed, bipolar disorder is the leading cause of suicide in the nation, with 15 to 20% of those with my disease completing suicide. Didn't say attempting, I said completing. During my clerkship, I took and passed the Florida bar exam. Fortunately, my disorder had not been diagnosed, and I had never sought counseling, so I truthfully could deny having any mental illness on the very intrusive Florida bar character and fitness questionnaire. Judge Choflat eventually convinced me to seek psychiatric treatment, and I took psychotropic medication for the first time. My time in law practice was not a success. I grew so depressed that I was hospitalized for the first time. Due to stigma fears, I kept the real nature of my condition a secret. I told them I was having GI problems, and they believed me. Finally, in May of 1983, I attempted suicide and was voluntarily admitted to the Locke Psychiatric Unit at a local hospital. Eventually, my psychiatrist sent me to Highland Hospital, which is a private psychiatric facility in Asheville, North Carolina, where I was a patient for the remaining 6 months of 1983, and which ironically was operated at one time by the Duke Psychiatry Department. Highland was best known as the Mountain Retreat, where Zelda Fitzgerald, who was the widow of famous author F. Scott Fitzgerald, died in a 1948 fire. By the time I reached Highland, I was in pretty bad shape. I couldn't focus or concentrate, and my memory was almost totally shot. When I've had a severe breakdown like this, it feels like my brain has suffered a severe electrical shock, short-circuited, and withdrawn into itself, such that it takes a long time to return to normal. I need quiet and rest and much medical care in order to function in the world again. I got this while I was at Highland. While no one in Highland told me I had bipolar disorder, my doctor put me on lithium and an antidepressant, and I gradually improved. When I was ready for discharge, my employer, who now knew about my illness, told my doctor I was not welcome to return to the firm. After about 6 months, I won a job teaching for a year as a legal assistant for a federal magistrate judge. Combine that 6 months with 6 months in Highland, I lost a year out of my working life to this. While I was working for the magistrate judge, I won a one-year position teaching at the University of Chicago Law School, teaching legal research and writing. In Chicago, I regained my health despite the stress of teaching for the first time and searching for a permanent law teaching job. And the Brandeis School of Law hired me to start in August of 1986. I went to a University of Louisville psychiatrist who was the first doctor actually to tell me I have bipolar disorder, although I long had suspected as much because of the permanent lithium prescription. I didn't disclose my psychiatric history to anyone at the law school because of stigma fears. Over the years, although my mood swings and medications interfered with my scholarship, I wrote enough articles to win tenure in 1992. In 1997, I was promoted to the rank of full professor of law. Things went reasonably well until 2004, when I learned I had a major medical problem caused by long-term lithium ingestion. I underwent major surgery and had to go off lithium. Unfortunately, the quick withdrawal from lithium caused a severe manic episode, and I was hospitalized for over 3 weeks. As I was unable to work in the fall of 2004, my wife had to tell the Brandeis dean about my condition, thus disclosing the secret I had maintained for over 18 years. Fortunately, the dean kept my situation totally quiet and gave me a medical leave. I then told a few close faculty friends about my condition and was pleased to see their supportive reaction, along with their shock that I had kept the secret for so long. Over the next 3 years, I gradually returned to normal. Mania caused me to vacillate between irritability and euphoria, and suicidal depressions were also a major issue. I went on a cocktail of over 5 different psychiatric drugs, including a powerful antipsychotic, to control my symptoms. When euphoric, I had episodes of theatricality, amusing irrelevancy, and even singing in class. One day I was teaching about the badges of undue influence in will contests, and I launched into the famous badges, we don't need no stinking badges, routine from Mel Brooks' comedy classic Blazing Saddles. Another day, I started singing a song from Young Frankenstein when we were discussing the relative merits of it as opposed to Blazing Saddles. Interesting digression in a Will's class. Mel Brooks movies. Students were too polite to complain. I don't know if you guys would be that polite. At the same time, I contemplated going public with my disorder to the legal academic community in an effort to fight stigma and show there are successful law professors with severe mental illness. I decided to reach this audience through an article in the Journal of Legal Education, and by mid-2007, circulated a draft to a few individuals, including Ken Kress. I then learned about Professor Sachs and that her memoir was due out in the near future. Coincidentally, 2 law professors with severe mental illness were going to go public at essentially the same time. Ellen and I have been best friends ever since we found each other. We talk on the phone every day. The JLE accepted my article, Walking the Tightrope of Bipolar Disorder, The Secret Life of a Law Professor, and it was published in early 2008. This may be only the second law professor in the United States publicly to acknowledge suffering from a severe mental illness. I soon became an active mental health advocate by writing and speaking widely to groups of lawyers, law students, medical students, nursing students, psychology students, occupational therapy students, social work students, and others about successful professionals with severe psychiatric disorders. I've won several awards in recognition of my efforts. Despite periodic problems like episodes of extreme suicidality in 2008 and paranoid delusions in 2013, I've lived a fulfilling life. In 2011, I published my own memoir, A Hidden Madness. As I've demonstrated, a law professor who's been hospitalized 5 times with severe bipolar disorder can be a highly successful professional. When this incapacitated me, as in 1983 and 2004, like the Energizer Bunny, I have gradually bounced back. I'll always have a serious mental illness, but work at the highest level nonetheless. My nearly 30 years in legal academics is a clarion call. In conclusion, mental illness is a pervasive problem in modern society, especially in the legal and medical professions. Medical and law students and professionals battle anxiety, depression, and suicide at levels far greater than those in the general population. Because of fear of stigma, many with mental illness stay in the shadows. They fear to seek treatment because the concerns over damaging job prospects are causing difficulty in obtaining or keeping a law or medical license. Society, and in particular the law and medical professions, should, and hopefully increasingly will, recognize the truth about professionals in these fields with serious mental diseases. All are people, all face challenges, and all can live good lives of substantial accomplishments despite their psychiatric conditions. May also situated be encouraged to join the high-functioning Elizabeth Baxter, Fred Freeze, Kay Jamison, Ellen Sachs, Marjorie Silver, Greg Duell, and Jim Jones in a world free of stigma and discrimination against those with severe mental illness. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions. There's a question. Yes, sir.
Professor Jones, thank you for being here. So you talked about how people coming out and talking about their mental illness and how they're high functioning with it helps reduce stigma. What other ways can we get rid of stigma for people having mental illness?
Well, your generation can get older because that's not tend to be funny. Generation by generation, stigma is less bad. I mean, my mother's generation, my mother's 92, that generation of stigma was horrible. My generation, it's not great. Your generation is much more accepting. When I talk to nursing students, they're like, what's the issue? Why is there stigma? So that's sort of a natural development. Just generally, people need to understand that 20% of the population in any given year has a mental health issue going on. Not all of them are serious to the extent that I'm talking about the serious illnesses, but still, there are plenty of people out there And you hear about you hear about professional athletes and other, authors and people like that who become actresses, actors who go public, and that has some impact. But it's going to take a long time. I mean, mental illness has been stigmatized. I mean, you were possessed by demons in the Middle Ages if you had a mental illness. 100 years ago, you were shackled to the wall with metal shackles in a psychiatric hospital. Only really in the last 50, 60 years have they had medications that were somewhat effective. And they had such horrible side effects that people don't want to take them. I mean, Fred Freeze, who I was talking about, he has a horrible case of tardive dyskinesia, which is a movement disorder you get from taking antipsychotics. He you can barely understand him when he talks. I mean, I have TD also. I have a mild case of tardive dyskinesia because of antipsychotic drugs. So, it's a bad disease to suffer from. It would be nice if you were not considered to be different from people with high blood pressure or cancer or something, diabetes, something like that, who also have chronic illnesses that there is not a stigma with. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, what do you think law schools and medical schools can do to try to nurture or reduce the mental illness effects that happen to their students over time?
Well, I mean, for one thing, in law school, they could focus more in the first year on not harassing students the way they generally do, and recognize that there are issues. I mean, I mentioned that lawyers are not warm and fuzzy people. I wasn't just joking when I said that. That's not a personality trait that many lawyers have, and certainly law professors don't have. There are, like I said, Marjorie Silver has courses that she offers about how to, live law school better. There needs to be a culture change, really, because it's not a good situation when at the end of 2 semesters of law school, 30% of your students are depressed, and by graduation, 40% are depressed. That's horrible if you think about it. Why are we taking young people who were perfectly normal when they got to law school or medical school and turning them into, people with mental illnesses? It would also be nice if universities offered really good counseling and the like for students, because a lot of law schools have nothing whatsoever in that regard. In our law school, we send people over to the counseling center where they get some help. Some law schools have actually got counselors on their staff so that, in the building, there's somebody that you can talk to. It would also be nice if the bar people didn't discriminate the way they do, which made students afraid to get counseling if it was available. I mean, if you think, and even though you'll probably get a license regardless, students don't believe that. They know, oh my God, if I get counseling, I've got to report it, and then they're going to maybe turn me down for a license. If you didn't have that situation, it would be much better, because students would be willing to get care. There are states in the U.S. where you're not treated that way. California has one question in their bar application: do you presently have a condition that interferes with your ability to practice law? They don't do like Kentucky and ask 6 or 7 different questions, all focusing on whether you have a mental illness. I get recommendation requests from the bar for students who are signing up for the bar exam, and they have the question: to your knowledge, has this person ever been arrested, fired from a job, a couple of other things, or suffer from any mental or emotional issue? I find that patently offensive, that question. I would refuse to answer it, other than if I did, the students that I didn't answer it for might have problems with the bar. But these are all things that can be changed, should be changed, and if they are changed, will bring a real change, I think, in the way law students, medical students are treated, how they will react, and in turn, how practicing lawyers and doctors will act also. Yes, ma'am.
Aside from some of the institutionalized stigma of mental illness that you've described, to what extent do you think that part of this is also a problem of this unyielding culture of work in our country that doesn't well accommodate people who have chronic medical or psychiatric problems that where they'll have episodes throughout their career where they're less than 110% productive. And without some accommodations for that, like, you know, it really struck me in your talk that many of the people you described, just, it blew me away that they could have achieved, yourself included, as much as you have, given periods of illness and having to step away from the professional world. So, you know, how do we overcome that barrier of this unremitting culture of work that doesn't accommodate for any time away?
Well, first of all, we convinced people in the sector that there is something called the Americans with Disability Act out there. Because under it, you can't discriminate against somebody because of a disability, no matter what kind of disability it is. That's not just people who can't see or hear or mobility impaired. That's people with mental illnesses too. It's a practical matter. If you have a mental illness in our culture work situation and it comes out, you'll lose your job most places. I mean, I know of partners in law firms who developed depression or something and their law firm ran them off, even though they were partners. It's no mystery or secret that everybody I talked about essentially was a professor with tenure. Because professors with tenure can, first of all, they're going to be accommodated because of where they work, and second of all, if you have tenure, it can't fire you. You know, I mean, if I didn't have tenure, I never would have gone public because I would have been afraid of what would have happened to me. I mean, even having tenure, it was a major step to go public. I mean, that's why there's not very many people who've done it. You know, 4 law professors in the whole country is not a whole lot of law professors. There's 2 others that have gone public. So like 6 law professors in the whole country is not a lot. And, you know, very few people in other fields do it. And like I said, we need to recognize, first of all, we need to recognize that people with severe mental illnesses can be functioning, successful people. And when they're sick, they'll get better. Well, they're always sick. I mean, one thing about mental illness people don't necessarily realize is, with the possible exception of depression, when you've got a chronic mental illness like bipolar schizophrenia, it's a lifetime thing. It doesn't go away. It can be managed through medical care, but it does not go. It's like diabetes or something like that. You know, you've always got it. Now, society is, I think, much more accepting of like people with diabetes when they get sick. They, you know, they don't fire them because of that. And yeah, I mean, in general, the society needs to be more understanding of people with disabilities. But I think a lot of areas it's not the problem that it is. I mean, you know, if you've got diabetes, you're not necessarily accepted to work 110% all the time. You can have periods when you are less than 110% and are okay. Mental illness, not so much. Yes, sir.
Just a follow-up question on that, specifically with respect to the ADA. So I was involved a few years ago in a study that evaluated the outcomes of ADA litigation under Title I, basically claims of employment discrimination. And we compared people with physical disabilities, shall we say, to those with psychiatric disabilities as the essence of their disability. And there was a huge, I mean, we titled the paper, which is published in the University of Maryland Law Review, Justice Disparities, because there's a huge disparity in the outcome of those lawsuits for people with mental illnesses and those disabilities compared to their counterparts with physical disabilities. And and it was a pretty dismal picture in terms of what actually people were able to get in terms of a remedy or a settlement or something. But one of the things we tried to unpack was this perception that, well, you know, if you can't perform your job, then right. So there's this perception that it's the failure to perform up to specifications that renders that ADA claim non-meritorious. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Is that part of what needs to be changed in terms of perception, or is the ADA flawed in that way? I mean, because basically it looked like a false promise in terms of, you know, using the ADA. maybe it's changed the culture, but for those individuals, it didn't seem to provide a whole lot of benefit.
Well, first I will tell you incidentally, I'm not a mental health law expert. I'm a law professor with mental illness, so I'm not an ADA expert. I do know something about it. ADA says you got to give somebody reasonable accommodation, but they have to be able to perform the job function. And a lot of courts don't recognize mental illness as something that qualifies under it. So you're right, yeah, there's been a dismal success rate on ADA claims based on mental illness, much worse than other areas. And again, some of that is stigma, misunderstanding, whatever. You know, courts just haven't gone along with it. Just like the licensing litigation. I mean, there's been a very, because there have been ADA claims. I mean, the Justice Department was an ADA claim. And some courts have upheld the state licensing laws. Others have said they're ADA violations. So you can't even get agreement in the federal courts in the U.S. as to what's legal and not legal under the ADA. And that's why the Justice Department is going state by state to try to get these questions set aside. They won in Louisiana, and now the question is where they're going to go next. Ohio is where one of my colleagues who's an expert on this thinks they're going to go next. I'd like them to go to Kentucky next. Because you talk to the people at the bar, and they're like, you know, we're going to do what we want to do, and we don't care about the ADA.
Just a quick follow-up on this with respect to the stigma issue, you know, and I think this was an important part of it in our study, because we asked people in the study, do other people view you as disabled? You know, is your disability visible or not? And if you have a physical disability, having a visible disability, such as being in a wheelchair, versus having back pain that people can't see, actually helps people in getting a higher success in their ADA claim. With mental illness, it was just the opposite. People who said, yeah, other people know I have a mental illness, that was correlated with a lower success rate, which I think probably has to do with how people view people. I mean, particularly if they know about it versus not. So there was a disparity just with respect to, you know, the recognition of it and in this service. I think it's certainly part of it. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think the problem is clear.
Well, I mean, you know, it's definitely, I mean, if you got somebody at work who you say you don't want to work with because you're afraid of them, because they got a diagnosis of a mental illness, I mean, that's a major problem. I mean, if you go to work every day thinking you're going to be shot or something by the person that you work with, I mean, none of my colleagues have expressed concern about me attacking them or something like that, but I'm sure they want to. I mean, one thing you always notice, if you ever get angry or something like that, you know, I mean, I'm a person, I get angry. Well, if I get angry, it's like, oh my God, he's getting symptomatic, you know, versus if somebody else got angry, well, he's angry. You know, if Ellen is having delusional problems, you know, people, I mean, it's 100% certain that you're treated differently if you have a mental disability. I mean, first of all, most people with mental disabilities don't tell anybody about it, again, because the stigma fears. I mean, the person who is in the wheelchair or, you know, whatever, I mean, yeah, they're visibly disabled. I don't know about people who have back pains and things like that. I don't know if they tell you they've got back pain, you may be somewhat sympathetic for it, depending on how old you are and how much pain you're used to. But you don't tell people you're depressed or much less schizophrenic or have bipolar disorder, because you are very afraid of the result that you're going to have if you do that. You're about ready to have your lunch break.
Yeah, so I think we are ready for our lunch break. Thank you so much, Professor Jones.